This is Game Night with Josh Hennig.
It's good!
On 97.3 ESPN and the 97.3 ESPN free mobile app.
And he scored!
Now live from inside the Ocean Casino Resort studio, here's Josh Hennig.
This is a special YouTube-only exclusive edition here live in the Ocean Casino Resort Studios on my YouTube channel at Josh Hennig on the Twitter X platform, at Joshua S. Hennig on Instagram is where you can find me. You know, I finished all my work around the studio, and, you know, I was texting with a friend, and I'll disclose who it was. It was Nick Earnshaw. Nick Earnshaw from Nick's Nuggets on the Sports Bash and the producer for the Locker Room on the weekends here on 97.3 ESPN. And I mentioned the subject of the Eagles to him, and I want to present to all of you out there my question. And it's the question that I don't understand why every time I have brought this question up, nobody wants to discuss it. And I've been trying to decipher if the reason why people don't want to discuss it is because it's not trendy, because it's an uncomfortable conversation. And I want to preface this by saying this is not a let's vacate responsibility from Nick Sirianni. This is not a conversation to take any heat off of anyone else who deserves blame, because I think there are people who deserve blame, but typically in an organization, right? They always say, well, when it comes to the football team, the buck stops with the head coach. But when it comes to the organization, the buck stops with the general manager, the head of the organization. So I was listening to Michael Lombardi, former NFL general manager, on the GM Shuffle podcast. And when he made this comment, I almost wanted to scream, because when we look back at the Eagles' embarrassing loss in Tampa, when we look back on the horrible collapse at the end of the Falcons game, when we look at the fact that Bryce Huff has been a complete failure, when we have questions about if Jordan Davis, a first-round draft pick, is good enough to be an every down defensive tackle in the NFL, when we ask these questions, why are we not blaming the person responsible for everything? Here's what Michael Lombardi said on the GM Shuffle podcast.
Sirianni's got himself a hole, because I think at the end of this hole, his defense talent-wise isn't good enough. Because what I'm saying is the design was probably the right idea. Maybe they might have picked the wrong players. And I thought Bryce Huff would be a good player for him, but he's not been anything very good. And I can imagine Vic's going crazy over it.
I asked this question 2 weeks ago. I asked it again last week. And I tried to ask this question again yesterday on 97.3 ESPN. And that is, why is nobody wanting to question Howie Roseman? See, everyone wants to point to Nick Sirianni. And listen, I said before the season that if Sirianni does not win at least 10 games and get to the second round of the postseason, he should be fired. That position has not changed. There is obviously an issue when it comes to Nick Sirianni and this team. And, you know, every pundit on television and radio and on digital media is going to bring up the Sirianni-Hurts relationship. But the person we're not talking about is the man who has kept Nick Sirianni his job. And that is Howie Roseman. Jeffrey Lurie is the owner of the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, let follow the big picture here, because unlike the television shows with the hot takes, and unlike the Philly stations that have blowhards who don't even know half of anything about football. I want to try to open your guys' mind to something that's bigger than the low-hanging fruit that these trolls out there feast on all the time and get fat on. So here's the real meat. Here's the real deep conversation. All right? Jeffrey Lurie is the owner of the Philadelphia Eagles. Jeffrey Lurie has been very consistent on 2 points during his time as the Eagles owner. He has consistently said that he wants to be 5 years ahead, and he wants there to be a relationship between the head coach and the general manager that is very symbiotic. That is, they're not thinking each other's thoughts or repeating each other all the time, but there is a healthy working relationship. And part of the reason why the owner said this was because he saw what happened during the Ray Rhodes 3 years and during the Chip Kelly 3 years, and he has tried to avoid that ever happening again. And the reason why Doug Peterson was fired after the 2020 season was not because he had a losing season, but because Doug Peterson has consistently gone to bat for the coaches that he likes and is comfortable with. And those coaches he likes and is comfortable with, he would not compromise to take off of his staff. So the owner said, I can't have you coaching my team then if you're going to have Press Taylor be the offensive coordinator and be calling plays. And as we're seeing now, 4 years later in Jacksonville, the concerns of the owner, Jeffrey Lurie, paid off because the Jags are struggling offensively and Press Taylor's calling the plays. And when Doug Peterson was asked in Jacksonville, would you take back calling the plays? Doug didn't want to answer the question. So there obviously is a block or some issue that is preventing Doug Peterson from putting the best coaches on his staff. So it's not that the owner is being overbearing or dictating, but we have seen with Doug Peterson in Jacksonville, just like we saw with Ray Rhodes in Green Bay, that the Eagles owner has made some good decisions in the past. It was the owner, Jeffrey Lurie, who said back in 2015, I want my football team back, before he fired Chip Kelly, who Chip Kelly kept insisting he needed more and more power to have a successful football team, and Jeffrey Lurie finally had enough. So I want to put that context in this framework of the question I'm asking. The reason why Howie Roseman is the executive vice president of football operations and the de facto general manager of this team is because Lurie trusts him. He trusts him implicitly. They have a high functioning professional relationship. They see the football world through the same lens. And because neither man is a traditional football guy, Jeffrey Lurie comes from the arena of film. Okay, he was a Hollywood guy, and he's a guy from New England. He's not traditionally a football guy in the traditional sense. And Howie Roseman never played football, never coached football. He was a guy who went to law school and tried to get an internship with every NFL team, and eventually found his way to the Eagles and worked his way up the ladder of the organization. So these two men have a relationship that dates back about 24, 25 years. And Jeffrey Lurie has seen Howie work his way up the ladder. And as Lurie gets older, I think Lurie realizes that his son is going to need to lean on somebody whenever Jeffrey wants to walk away from the full-time ownership responsibilities of this team. And I don't think we're too far away from that. So that brings us to the Nick Sirianni question. Nick Sirianni is the head coach because the owner and the general manager, Jeffrey Lurie and Howie Roseman, are comfortable and believe in what Nick Sirianni is doing. And if there was an issue with Sirianni last year, I guarantee you he would have been fired because that is Lurie's track record. He did it to Ray Rhodes. He did it to Andy Reid. He did it to Chip Kelly. He did it to Doug Peterson. There's no one saying he wouldn't do it to Nick Sirianni. But when we look at the problems with the Eagles right now, and when Michael Lombardi asks that question about, do the Eagles have good enough players on defense to do what needs to be done? The finger goes directly to Howie Roseman, because Howie Roseman asked this question this offseason, and he answered his own question. He said, was our defensive secondary good enough last year? And Sirianni, who was deaf-mute, just not even involved in the press conferences when Howie brings this up, which is a clear sign of what I'm trying to tell you guys here. Howie Roseman said, no, our defense secondary was bad last year. He said, I did a bad job at putting a roster together. We were very focused on rebuilding secondary. And they did, by the way. C.J. Gardner-Johnson, drafting Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. They did invest a lot of resources into revamping the secondary. But did they focus so much on the secondary that they neglected other positions? More from Michael Lombardi on the GM Shuffle podcast.
One of the things I think you have to be honest with yourself as a general manager is you assessed your problems, right? And Howie Roseman said, okay, I need better pass rushers. I need to fix my secondary, and I'm going to be okay, right? And so he does that. He gets Bryce Huff. He gets rid of Riddick. He keeps Sweat, but they haven't really fixed their D-line. Like Jalen Carter got worn out. He played too many plays.
And that is, I think, the bigger problem. When you lost Fletcher Cox from this team, when you saw Javon Hargrave leave in free agency, when the Eagles made the decision to go in this youth movement direction, the Eagles have one of the youngest rosters in the NFL. I wrote about this in 973 ESPN.com a month ago. And I remember asking the question, will the Eagles' youth be an impediment for this team? And I think we're starting to see that a little bit. I think that we are starting to see that the overwhelming amount of youth that Howie Roseman gave Nick Sirianni and Vic Fangio and Kellen Moore, more so the defense and the offense. The Kellen Moore question is another conversation. But specifically for the defense, this is now a concern at the bye week. You let Hassan Reddick leave, or you push him out the door, however you want to frame it. You paid Bryce Huff big money with the idea that the Eagles' philosophy for the last, let's go with 25 years. It started with Joe Bannon when he was the head of the organization before Howie Roseman basically came and took Joe Banner's job. The philosophy of the Jeffrey Lurie era is you move on from players before they're too old to play for you. And only in a handful of situations have the Eagles not followed that philosophy. And the owner, Jeffrey Lurie, and the executive vice president of football operations, Howie Roseman, have both admitted they made mistakes with that when it came to guys like Jason Peters, for example. And that they tried to make decisions on keeping winning windows open by giving guys like Alshon Jeffrey contract extensions that handcuffed them and put them in a position where they had to do some hard roster turnovers. So that brings us now to 2024. The Eagles are 2-2 at the bye week. But the bigger picture is they've lost 8 of their last 11 games. And we saw last year the defense wasn't good enough. And we saw on Sunday the defense couldn't get the job done. And we can blame the Heat all we want. We can blame Nick Sirianni, Vic Fangio all we want. We can blame the players all we want. But at the end of the day, there's one man who is making the final roster decisions, trades, free agent signings, draft picks. It's Howie Roseman. So the question I ask, again, that people seem to be afraid to want to have a conversation about is Howie Roseman to blame for this? Remember, it was Howie who made the moves on draft day multiple years, not once but twice, to get these Georgia defensive linemen. Howie made the trades to go get Jordan Davis, to go get Jalen Carter. And while I don't fault him as much for the Jalen Carter move, because I think that anyone with 2 eyes can see that Jalen Carter has an incredible amount of potential, and it's just about harnessing that ability in the correct way. And, maybe it is as simple as, as certain players will say that you need a more veteran player in that locker room to help channel that energy, which then goes back to the problem of the roster being too young. I think Howie Roseman and the Eagles were so intent on trying to get their young players on the field that they forgot the model that made them the most successful. When they went to the World Series, I got the baseball playoffs on behind me, so my brain had a little bit of a, woo, hello, back to reality, Josh. But the Super Bowl, right? So 2022, 2017, 2004. What did all of those teams have in common? They were an amazing blend of veteran leadership with young players. So when you put those two together, when you merge the balance together, you're not too old, you're not too young. It's like the porridge with the 3 bears. It's just right. You know what I mean? It's not too hot. It's not too cold. And I think that is the mistake the Eagles tend to make, which is they go too many veterans, like with the dream team, Vince Young and Nnamdi Asomugha and Jason Babbitt and that whole fiasco. Or they go too young, like they did in the early Andy Reid tenure, when they just kept trying to put out as many young receivers as possible because they were afraid to spend money on wide receiver. Or like we saw in 2020 and 2021, where the team just had so many young players and so much inexperience that the locker room was just barren when it came to veteran leadership. And I think you're seeing it again now. I asked this question last year on 97.3 ESPN and right here on my YouTube channel at Josh Hennig on YouTube. Thank you for watching. Hit that like button, subscribe, share with your friends. I asked this question last year, and I'll ask it again. Who's the Malcolm Jenkins on this team? Who's the Brian Dawkins on this team? Who's the Jeremiah Trotter on this team? Who's the Chris Long on this team? Veteran players who have been there, done that, who can literally and figuratively get in guys' faces and say, I need more from you. I expect more of you. People forget that in 2017, when Carson Wentz was injured and his season was over, that locker room was almost dead. And it was Malcolm Jenkins who got up and said, we're all we got, we're all we need. It was guys like Chris Long who started handing out the underdog masks, right? In 2004, it was Jeremiah Trotter who came back for his second time, who got in guys' faces and said, we need to be better. We have to play as a team to win a championship. Veteran leadership matters. And I think the problem with the Eagles is why I point the finger at Howie Roseman. You didn't make sure that there were vested veterans on this team, Howie. So how am I supposed to blame everyone else if the person who's building the roster is not doing his job? I think it's very simple. Why is everyone afraid to point the finger at Howie Roseman? And until someone answers that question for me, I'm going to keep asking it. And if I have to be the broken record, if I have to be the bad guy, and I got to be the villain, it's 2024. So 7 years ago, I was the guy pounding the table defending Howie Roseman. Now, 7 years later, I'm pounding the table asking, why am I the only one questioning Howie Roseman? It's like dealing with politics. Sports conversation has devolved in some ways into politics. Everyone wants a boogeyman. Everyone wants a villain. And when you bring up legitimate, real issues, and I haven't watched the vice presidential debate, I'll see the highlights later, and I'll probably feel like I need a stiff drink after watching it. But in the political world, and one of the reasons why, for those who don't know my background, I actually used to work in the news talk radio world. And one of the things that drove me nuts was that a lot of times when we had socio-political conversations, they would devolve into this person's stupid, this person's anti-American. And instead of walking up to the table and say, let me explain to you why this candidate or that candidate is not the right man or woman for the job, people would just mudsling. And it became exhausting. And one of the things I love about sports talk is that I feel like sports fans are much more open-minded to have conversations than the average, person who's not in the sports world will. You try to have a conversation, for example, with people like Clay Travis and Outkick about certain subjects, and they don't want to hear it. And the same thing goes to Blaze TV, and the same thing goes to CNN, and the same thing goes to MSNBC. These people are so close-minded, they can't see the forest for the trees if they ran into the tree. It's exhausting. And so when it comes to sports, you're seeing part of this conversation devolve in that same blender. Like this comment right here on my YouTube channel. Hurts is trash. Shaking my head. Well, son of seed, first of all, thank you for watching and commenting. And you actually have a legitimate picture on your comment, so I actually can tell that you might be a legitimate person commenting and not some troll with a, what is that? What is that avatar, like the blank avatar that people have when they're on like Twitter now? Like they'll troll you on Twitter with like a picture of like I don't know, like some weird picture, and it's like, well, it's not a real person. I can't respect that person because there's no picture on it. So anyway, back to my point with this comment. So first of all, respect for you for commenting, watching, getting involved in the conversation. But your comment is an example of what's wrong with this conversation. Hurts is trash. Well, Hurts isn't trash because Hurts is still better than half the quarterbacks in the league. So if Hurts is trash, then everyone else is what? Worse than trash? Does Jalen Hurts have a turnover problem? Yes. Does he have a turnover problem because he is turnover prone, or does he have a turnover problem because he's overthinking? Does he have a turnover problem because he's an idiot, or does he have a turnover problem because the coaches are not getting through to him? Why was Jalen Hurts an MVP runner-up with Shane Steichen in 2022? Why was Jalen Hurts a Heisman Trophy runner-up in 2019 at Oklahoma with Lincoln Riley? But he has never reached that same level of production and success with any other coaches. He couldn't do it with Nick Saban at Alabama. He couldn't do it with Doug Peterson. He couldn't do it with Brian Johnson last year. And so far this year, he hasn't done with Kellen Moore. Why is that? That's the question that should be asked about Jalen Hurts. But people don't want to ask that question because that question for certain people, like in Philadelphia Talk Radio and the hot take artists on like First Take and Fox Sports, they don't want to have that conversation because that conversation opens the door to more nuance, to layers. And people don't like nuance and layers because they're just lazy, some of them. I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to have a conversation, all right? So, to me, I don't think Hurts is trash. I think Hurts has one of two problems. Either Jalen Hurts is somebody who is trying so hard to make it like he is earning the money that he signed for. I think there's a part of Hurts that genuinely thinks that he has to earn every cent of his contract. And I think he's trying too hard. He's overthinking. I think that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is, how do I have a guy who was statistically one of the best quarterbacks in college football in 2019, who was the better player than Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl 2 years ago? How do I have that guy for 2 separate years over the course of 6 years? So that means 33% of the time, Jalen Hurts is capable of being a high-level quarterback. But the other 66% of the time, he's not. I can't say that about Kirk Cousins. I can't say that about, I'm trying to think of a guy here, Andy Dalton. I can't say that about Deshaun Watson. I can't say is completely falling apart, it looks like. I can't say that about Joe Flacco. I can't say that about Geno Smith. I can't say that about I was going to say Phillip Rivers, but I forgot he's not even in the league anymore. Justin Herbert. I can't say that about all these other guys. Look, it's clear who the best quarterbacks in the league are. It's Mahomes, it's Josh Allen, it's Joe Burrow. Yeah, Herbert deserves to be in the conversation to some extent, but not totally. Lamar Jackson deserves to be in the conversation. Jalen Hurts is not there. But just because Jalen Hurts is not one of the 5 or 7 best quarterbacks in the league doesn't mean he's trash. And I think that is where, for me, am I splitting hairs? Maybe. Am I being too particular about how I use my words? Yes, I am. Because I will not be lazy-minded with these conversations. So, how does this relate to Howie Roseman? Well, is Howie Roseman hiring the right people for these jobs? Is Kellen Moore as good of a coordinator as we thought he was? Kellen Moore, former quarterback. We thought he could communicate something new to Jalen Hurts. We were told all offseason by Nick Sirianni, by Jalen Hurts, by Kellen Moore, by Jason Kelce on his podcast, by Lane Johnson, by Jordan Mailata. We were told by anyone who would have a conversation, oh man, we've been working all offseason on to handle the blitz. We've been working all offseason to prepare Jalen Hurts to deal with Todd Bowles' blitz. And then when we get to Tampa, Jalen Hurts gets sacked 6 times, and one player, and Fred Johnson, allows the quarterback to be pressured 8 times alone. Now, I understand no Lane Johnson had an impact on it. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if they're picking on one offensive lineman, maybe slide the protection that way. We saw the same thing in New Orleans, by the way, even when the Eagles had a fully healthy offensive line. What did the Saints do at times? They loaded the pass rush to one side. They overloaded one side of the line. So why can't Kellen Moore see that? But we want to blame Sirianni for everything. We want to blame Jalen Hurts for everything. Why does nobody want to blame the coordinator? Because he looks like a Mormon? I mean, come on. He looks like a kid. I don't think Kellen Moore even shaves. I have more facial hair growth in like a day than he does in a week. People are afraid to be critical of him. He looks like a kid. Come on. Now, look, if you want to say Jalen is not good at reading the blitz, okay, fine. I can work with that. The problem is NFL Next Gen Stats show that the first 3 weeks of the season against the Packers and the Falcons and the Saints, he was one of the league leaders in completion percentage against the blitz. So is it just Todd Bowles is the problem? Does Kellen Moore just not know how to communicate to Jalen Hurts, how to work with Todd, how to get around the Todd Bowles blitz? So we get back to Howie Roseman. Howie Roseman and the Eagles wanted to hire Kellen Moore. They went to Sirianni and said, we need a different offense. We need a better offense. We need a better offensive play caller. We need a Shane Steichen level coordinator. Kellen Moore had some very, very successful seasons in Dallas. And even when half the team got injured with the Chargers last year, he still found a way to keep certain players productive, especially tight ends. So my thinking was, knowing the guy's track record, he could come in here and plan accordingly. But for whatever reason, nobody wants to blame Kellen Moore. It's all Nick Sirianni stinks. Jalen Hurts is trash. If Jalen Hurts is trash, then why did Howie Roseman give him that massive contract? If Nick Sirianni's an idiot, why is he still the head coach? And I'm going to keep asking these questions until somebody gives me a legitimate answer. Look, if you want to tell me that Nick Sirianni is not as good as, here's a list of coaches, I can work with that. You want to tell me that Sirianni is not as good as Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay? Okay, fine. John Harbaugh, Dan Campbell. Yep. Matt LaFleur, of course. Andy Reid, obviously. Would you take Jim Harbaugh over Nick Sirianni? I mean, I would, but I think there's a lot of Eagle fans who they like the idea. You know what Jim Harbaugh is? Jim Harbaugh is that beautiful woman that you see when you go out. And for some of you guys out there, because, you don't have a lot of not very worldly. Okay. I'm trying to be nice about it. Listen, I know I have a lot of guy friends who their conversational topics can only go so far, right? It's sports, it's movies, or it's, hunting, or it's trucks, or you have your 5-6 things, that not things, 5-6 subject that you're really strong on. And then you meet this woman, right? And for some of you out there, it becomes a problem because she starts talking to you about classical music or about, the writings of Winston Churchill, or, something that maybe is beyond your depth, or she's into Shakespeare or something. And she might be great at everything else. She may agree with your politics. She may have the same religious beliefs as you. She may be just on a scale of 1 to 10, aesthetically at 11, but you can't hold a conversation with her because she's got way more range than you do. I'm trying to figure out, is that just what we're dealing with here when it comes to this situation? Is Jim Harbaugh just, I feel like he would really mess with people mentally because I have observed Jim Harbaugh long enough to understand that even people who like Jim Harbaugh look at Jim Harbaugh like, dude, Like Jim Harbaugh went on a rant one time in Michigan about, so it was like 2018. So Jim Harbaugh explained that he doesn't eat chicken. This was 2018. He doesn't eat chicken because he's uncomfortable eating an animal that is that nervous. Then 3 years later, when they asked him about, hey, Jim, you haven't been tested positive for COVID. You didn't get the shot. Like, what's going on here? And Jim Harbaugh says, well, you got to admit I made a mistake. And they're like, well, what do you mean? He says, I used to hate chicken. And I realized chicken is really good, with all kinds of health benefits. And I started eating a lot of chicken, chicken soup. And so chickens have protected me from COVID. And people are like, all right, he went from one extreme to another. First, he was anti-chicken, and now he's chicken is the answer to COVID. And people are just like, Jim Harbaugh's a nut job. But Jim Harbaugh just has a lot of range. People like to make fun of Aaron Rodgers for some of the interviews he's done because he is a hyper intellectual, and he kind of like how do I put this? He flirts with conspiracy theories, right? And he kind of leans into the me against the world hates me, the world is like people like me, and it makes people uncomfortable. So, like, would you rather have Jim Harbaugh than Nick Sirianni? On the surface, yes. But if you were in a relationship with Jim Harbaugh, you might not like him as much. If you were in a relationship with Aaron Rodgers and got rid of Jalen Hurts, you might not like him as much, because the more you get to know certain people, you find out that their quirks and their oddities, they're not really for you, right? I think that's what I was really trying to say, but I probably didn't lay it out very well. I was literally thinking of somebody I know, and I didn't want to say their name here on my YouTube channel because they might end up watching. And I was thinking about them and some of the people they've dated and some of the conversations I've had with this guy about some of the women that he has dated. And I just remember thinking, oh man, dude, you really are a simpleton. Like that, like, you couldn't level up your game to keep up with someone like that. I mean, come on, man. But anyway, back to the Eagles. I think part of the problem is that, yes, I can think of 10 head coaches who are better than Nick Sirianni. I can think of at least 8 quarterbacks who are better than Jalen Hurts. It doesn't mean Sirianni or Hurts are trash. The bigger problem with Hurts and Sirianni is, one, why did the owner, Jeffrey Lurie, and the general manager, Howie Roseman, decide to keep Nick Sirianni? There had to be a reason. There had to be a reason why Jalen Hurts, they have invested so much into him resource-wise as the quarterback. There has to be a reason why the organization said no to Doug Peterson and Press Taylor, got rid of Brian Johnson and 90% of the coaches they had from last year, but kept Hurts and Sirianni. So to me, who is making these decisions? Who is signing Bryce Huff? Who is hiring Kellen Moore? Who is bringing in Vic Fangio? Who is drafting Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter? Who is the one who did not bring in ample veteran leadership and now has one of the youngest rosters in the NFL? That person is Howie Roseman. And that's the question that I am asking. Why does nobody want to talk about that? Why? Why are we scared to question the general manager? Now, look, I totally understand that football is a game of adjustments, and there's certainly a possibility that Philadelphia could come out of the bye week and win a bunch of games in a row. Okay. I'm not ignorant of that possibility, because realistically, when you look at their schedule, there is a chance that by the time the Eagles play the Cowboys in week 10 of the NFL season, that they could be on a winning streak, or they could have at least won 3 of the last 4 games, because you face Cleveland coming out of the bye. And let's be realistic, Cleveland, they have a lot of problems. Okay. It's probably going to be a rock fight game, but they have a lot of problems of just Cleveland. The Giants, not a good football team, and they're starting to get banged up. So you don't even know how healthy they're going to be by the time you face them on October 20th. Then you get the Bengals in Cincinnati. That's a coin flip game because, one, Cincinnati has their own set of problems they've been working through. And 2, if Cincinnati is at their best, they're probably beating you 35-30. Problem is Cincinnati's defense can be had. I know Trey Hendrickson, he might miss the rest of the season as their best pass rusher in Cincinnati. The Bengals offensive line has been okay. Joe Burrow has been inconsistent. The whole team is kind of a mess. But they're still a very good team. They can beat you. Jacksonville and Doug Peterson on Sunday Night Football, that's probably a win. Jacksonville is just a bad football team right now. So by the time you face the Cowboys on week 10 of the NFL season, you could very well be 5-3. And the idea of you being 2-2 and the embarrassing the embarrassing Bucks loss will be far behind you. And by the time you face the Cowboys could be on the opposite end of the spectrum of you. Because here are the Cowboys to play before they face you. Cowboys, who are also 2-2. They go to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's got a really good defense. The next week, they got Detroit. Detroit, they showed last night that if you don't play defensive against them properly, they are going to whip you. And we know the Cowboys are going to be without DeMarcus Lawrence for at least the next 4 games. Micah Parsons has a high ankle sprain. They are banged up and injured defensively. And it feels like every game, Diggs gets injured in the secondary. Detroit can shred them. So that could be 2 losses right there. Coming out of the bye week, they don't play San Francisco. By the time they play San Francisco, they're going to be healthier. There are some reports that Christian McCaffrey could be back by week 8. Deebo Samuel will be healthier by then. So will Trent Williams. And so will a lot of guys for that team. San Francisco could crush them. And then you got to play Atlanta on the road. What if Atlanta figures it out by then? We know Atlanta's got a solid, good defense. What if the offense figures out in the last couple of weeks and they blow out the Cowboys? The Cowboys could very well, while you're 5-3 going into week 10, the Cowboys could be, let's go do the math real quick. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. The Cowboys could be 3-5 while you're 5-3. And at that point, Eagle fans are feeling a lot differently about the team. And let's say you beat the Cowboys in week 10, then you're 6-3. Then you go into the game with Washington. It's at home, Thursday Night Football. You probably win that game. Now you're 7-3. Now you go into the interesting stretch of your schedule. At the Rams, at the Ravens. Let's say you split those. Well, now you're 8-4. You're beating Carolina. We don't have to discuss it. They stink. Okay? Then you got Pittsburgh. Probably a rock fight, but it's in your house. You probably win that. So now you're 10-4 with 3 games left of the season. Let's say you lose at Washington. You're 10-5. You're home against the Cowboys. You beat them once this year. You probably beat them again. Now you're 11-5. So now you being 2-2. Now Sirianni this, Jalen Hurts that, Howie Roseman this, Kellen Moore that, Bryce Huff this, Darius Slay that. All that conversation goes away because winning fixes all your problems. So, it's a balancing act we have between we got to stew on that horrible loss for 2 weeks because the Eagles are on a bye week. But at the same time, everyone wants to point the finger to Hurts and Sirianni. What is Howie Roseman's culpability in this? If the Eagles finish the year, I'm just throwing out a number, 9-8, right? They make the playoffs, they go 9-8. Their defense never comes around. Who do we blame for that? If Bryce Huff turns out to be a complete bust, who do we blame for that? If Jordan Davis never lives up to being a first-round draft pick, who do we blame for that? These are questions that need to be asked. At Josh Hennig on Twitter, X, Joshua S. Hennig on Instagram, and of course, usually on the air 6 p.m. Eastern time, Monday through Friday here on 97.3 ESPN FM. Wasn't on tonight because I was preempted for playoff baseball doubleheader. I'll be back tomorrow at my normal time slot right here on my YouTube channel at Josh Hennig. Like, subscribe, share with your friends. I appreciate everybody tuning in and dropping the likes, dropping the subscribes. And I'll catch you tomorrow on the radio right on my YouTube channel and streaming wherever you get the show. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging. Even if you don't agree with me, I like it. I appreciate all of you, including Sunseed, which I feel like there's got to be a story behind that username. Have a great night, everybody. I'll catch you tomorrow.